Good morning, Kansas City. This is Patrick Tuohey, Kansas City's second favorite Patrick, sitting in for Pete Mundo on the Pete Mundo Show. My guest this segment is Susan Pendergrass, the Director of Research at the Show Me Institute, where I serve as a senior fellow. She is pretty much my boss and maybe one of the smartest people I work with over there. Susan, good morning.
With that, welcome. Good morning to you as well. That's awesome.
Well, I'm setting you up now for the difficult questions, but
okay, here we go.
You and I both read in the Wall Street Journal. So you focus a great deal on education, and not just for the Show Me Institute, but you have for years. So this is kind of your wheelhouse. And you and I both read a story, I think in the Wall Street Journal the other day, that talked about how as Americans are just having fewer children, the absolutely predictable result is that fewer children are matriculating into school. There are just fewer children existing. And so we've got this bureaucracy, this system, this institution that is going to have to reckon with that. I'm trying to use as much neutral language as possible. And I know you have covered this in St. Louis, less so in Kansas City. But can you kind of lay out the observation maybe at the national or state level or whatever you're comfortable with? Like, what is it we're facing and how big a deal is it, if at all?
Yeah, I've certainly listened to national demographers and Dr. Annette Sandoval of St. Louis University, who does a lot of demographic work in St. Louis and Missouri areas. And Missouri is certainly absolutely following the national trends, which is at the state level, our biggest kindergarten cohort happened in about 2012-13. The Great Recession of 2007-8-9 is when birth rates peaked. And I guess people found that whole thing to be a little depressing. I don't know exactly why. That is the year that they peaked. And after that, they've declined. And now we're talking over 15 years of data. So then we know in Missouri, we are our biggest kindergarten cohort in 2012, just after that. And so we had our biggest high school graduating class like last year or the year before. These are all known numbers. And every kindergarten cohort has been progressively smaller in the meantime. So the idea that this is somehow going to change or turn around is false. It is not going to happen. And we can look at these numbers and clearly project that once Missouri could have claimed 7 million public school kids, roughly 950,000, 915, in the mid to high 900s. And we are now like 820,000, and it's projected that we'll be at more like 780,000 in the next decade. So we're seeing significant reductions in the number of kids. And it is not that they've gone somewhere else and haven't come back. It's that they weren't born. Now, there's a second trend that was in that Wall Street Journal article that's happening at the same time, which is that families in general seem to be abandoning the cities. So Kansas City and St. Louis are not known for having stellar school systems. So that trend, especially I know in St. Louis, they're in what Ness Sandoval calls a death spiral of more deaths than births and more people over 65 than under 17. So those school systems in particular, and I was just looking at Kansas City, they've lost 10% of their enrollment from before the pandemic. And this is not a pandemic problem. So the people who say it is are flat wrong. So they've lost about 10% from before the pandemic. And at the same time, they've hired an additional 70 teachers. So I really appreciate the question because I think a lot of people have their heads in the sand about this.
So I just want to make clear, because some of the statistics you cited were specific to public schools, but this is not a matter of fewer kids are going into public schools, they're going somewhere else. This is just a matter of fewer kids altogether. And the peak kindergarten or high school graduation is for all schools, whether home, public, charter, private.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The numbers are harder to get for private and home. So the public school numbers are pretty good and they've been collected for a pretty long time. But yes, there's no we do know that more families are homeschooling and more families are choosing private schools now because they can. But this is a demographic number based on birth rates. You know, the replacement birth rate, I think, is 1.9. We've been at like 1.6 nationally for enough time that we are declining. And I've heard estimates, this is a little depressing, but I've heard estimates that the U.S. population may begin to decline as soon as the 2050s. So it's so interesting to me because I just feel like we're in this kind of weird gray area right now where people are like, I don't know, I kind of like that my son's math class only had 8 kids in it. Pretty nice. You know what I mean? Still hiring teachers, fewer and fewer kids. And they're like, this is like the golden age of low teacher-student ratios. And it's a harbinger of something much worse.
So let me, are there any institutions, whether it's public schools or unions or states, are there any groups that have observed exactly what you've just told me and what the data show and are reacting to it? Or is this more kind of head in the sand? So, for example, I could imagine in a well-balanced, competent universe, the teachers' unions would be one of the first people to see this and have suggestions. But maybe that's not the case here.
No, it's not the case here because if anything, they're fighting it. I've been pointing out for a while that at the state level, the head of the public schools in the state, DESE, uses like a flat projected enrollment. Like this is the head in the sand thing. They're just pretending that this is temporary, and because the reality is, let's face it, they're going to have to start reducing staff. That's like, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it.
Right.
When a school district loses 10% of its students consistently every 5 years, the idea that you're going to either keep growing your staff, which is absurd. The Show Me Institute's got a paper coming out on this, that they're growing staff and they're growing the number of administrators and support staff. That's not going to be able to continue. And it's going to lead to some tough decisions. And, teachers get pretty solid contracts when they sign on to that profession. And it's not easy to fire teachers. And right now, if the teachers' unions and teacher and public school leadership were thinking about it, they would minimally not fill open positions. But, it's going to be the money's not going to be there. And a lot of public school funding is based on the number of kids, or some portion of it in Missouri. And those numbers are going to go down, and everyone's only lived in a world where they only go up. And when they start to go down, there's going to be a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the reality is, we're going to need more assisted living centers than schools. And not only are we going to have too much staff, we're going to have too many buildings. And this has happened. I mean, yes, there are some states that are doing a much better job of this, but certainly we could look to Japan and Italy and the countries that have dealt with it, and they have entire ghost towns. And we have lead time where we can think about this and be smarter about it. But, some places are co-locating senior centers with schools or community centers. And the idea in Missouri, I hear it all the time. We love our rural high schools. They're so important to the communities. Well, you don't necessarily need to close those buildings and what they do, but you could, they could stop being schools. They could just be community centers or gyms or whatever everybody loves about them, because we have a lot of school districts in Missouri, districts, mind you, with fewer than 100 kids.
Yeah.
Fewer than 50. That's not going to be able to continue.
My oldest daughter lives in a apartment building that used to be an elementary school in Kansas City. So yeah, there's already a lot of repurposing going on. So let me talk a little, because I know you've covered this for St. Louis, or at least talked about it. What is the move to kind of shift from services that focus on young people, if there are no young people, to focus on services that, well, in a few years will focus on you and I, Susan, as we get older? What does that look like?
I don't know what you're talking about, but maybe. Well, St. Louis is interesting because, to me, I think they have a real opportunity to. So as St. Louis population has declined, one interesting thing is that percentage of St. Louisans with college degrees has gone up. So, like, the pool has gotten smaller, but there's still a few major universities there. You've got Washington University and St. Louis University, and a couple of smaller ones. And so it's the city level more educated, and they have really incredible medical services available in research universities there, medical research universities. So St. Louis could position itself as a very attractive place for senior citizens to move. I'm saying, like, if not every senior citizen wants to go to Florida and live at the villages,
right,
then, you can take advantage of that and make St. Louis like a real center of arts and good healthcare and walkability and ADUs. You could be really generous with your zoning and let people put ADUs in their yards, and you could imagine a city that's very welcoming to seniors. But I think the first step is admitting that there's a problem.
Well, I want to joke that it's going to need to be more ADA than ADU if we're all in wheelchairs and things like that. So what are is there so again, part of it is realizing the market is changing and to your point, targeting services. Are there things legislatively, either at the city level or the state level that could be done? I mean, like you said, we see this coming. We see it in other countries. We have the data. We've had it for 30 years. What should we be doing to prepare for it?
Well, I think it's Tennessee. There are some states that have said when a district gets below a certain number of students, it goes on to sort of like a watch list, and they are given notice that unless it changes within 3 to 5 years, they will be consolidated. Missouri, like our fallback argument is that we're a local control state, so probably would be a tough thing to imagine happening, but we could do something like that. The governor appointed a task force a couple of years ago to look at how state funding for schools works. They're going to release a report. It's going to be met with a lot of hard feelings because some of our districts that have been getting more money than they should from the current system are going to face the reality of getting the right amount of money, and they're not going to like it. But that's where you're going to see declines in state funding that are going to result in, I would guess, smaller staff. That's what most school funding goes to, is staff. I already talked about like generous regulations, like you said, on ADUs and things like that. And then in St. Louis, there's a proposal to close, I think, 30 or so schools that need to be closed. The last few superintendents have said, look, we're going to have to reduce from 60-some schools down to more like 30. They have high schools built for 1,200 kids that have 150 in them. And already there's a parent group that's been formed and like they resist the close. I don't know what it's called. And they're trying to stop it because it's just really hard for people to accept the reality of this situation. So I think looking carefully at the number of buildings, I'm glad to know that your daughter lives in a former elementary school, looking carefully at the buildings and the real estate stock, looking carefully at, Columbia just opened a new elementary school. They have declining enrollment. Just opened a new elementary school and it's like half full. And they want to do a bond referendum to build more stuff. So I would be very cautious about these bond referendums that commit 20 and 30 years of public dollars to a shrinking system.
All right, last question. What can we do other than have more babies?
I think what we can do is just adjust to the new reality. I mean, stop denying it and just adjust to it. And, I think it's not necessarily dystopian, could be utopian. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good point. And I think the strongest takeaway is that we've imagined our school system constantly growing. And this is the first time, and not just the school system, but our population in general, where we may be shrinking. That is a completely different, that's different on government policy. That's different how we see ourselves. That's different spiritually as a national identity. And that's something we're going to have to grapple with. But to your point about the unions, it's going to be much easier to put our head in the sand.
Yeah.
Susan, I am grateful. This is not the happiest topic, but you've provided a lot of information that is good for me and our listeners. We can find more at the Show Me Institute. You said the Show Me's got a paper coming out on this. Do you know when that might be released?
Hopefully within the next few weeks, and we're that'll be coming out soon on how school districts have continued to hire in the face of declining enrollment. We certainly have a few podcasts that are already up.
Excellent. Susan, thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back. This is Patrick Tuohey sitting in for Pete Mundo on The Pete Mundo Show.